I've seen religions around the world. I've smelled their sacrifices. I've heard the bells ringing. I've watched the Muslims praying. And one thing I'm convinced of is this world is not getting less religious, it's getting more religious. Another thing I'm convinced of is we don't really understand the religions that other people share. And I think as a Christian in particular, it's essential for us to understand. It's hard to put them in categories, but if you wanted to try to put them in categories, you could say that there are religions like Islam and Judaism and Christianity, which are textual religions. They're based upon a holy text. So Islam is based upon the Quran, and Christianity based upon the Bible, and Judaism based upon the Torah and other ones of their sacred scriptures and commentaries. We all have commentaries, by the way. The Muslims have the Hadith. The Jews have actually volumes and volumes and volumes of rabbis, talking about things from books like the Mishnah, or collections of writings like the Mishnah. And Christians have their famous commentators too. We're writing them even today. But you have textual-based religions. So if you want to understand Christianity or Islam, if you want to understand Judaism, you go to the text, and the worldview constructs the text. It has all the authority wrapped up in language. But then there are image-based religions like Hinduism, religions like the ones that you see in the movies where people are laying down and worshiping idols. And sometimes Christians, if they want to understand Hinduism, their tendency is, let's go and read the Hindu text, like the Bhagavad Gita or the tale of the Mahabharata, things like this. You shouldn't go to the text first in Hinduism, because in Hinduism, it's the image and the story that's more important than the text. Lots of times Christians that want to understand Hinduism have a tendency to go read the text first, but you'd be much more prepared to understand Hinduism if you sat down and talked to someone that was a Hindu and you heard the stories about the many gods that they believe in. Sometimes as Christians we tend to say things like, how could a Hindu worship a god with all these different arms? It looks like a cartoon. But to a Hindu they would say, how can you worship a god you don't see? Because when a Hindu goes to worship, there are multiple different kinds of worship. One of those kinds of worship is called darshan, to behold the divine image. You see, what people believe about their religion influences the way they look at the whole world. And so, for instance, if a Christian missionary goes into a Hindu context and starts talking about Hinduism based upon the text just doesn't matter to lots of Hindus. What matters is the ritual. They participate in the gods that they know the stories about. So you have textual religions, and then you have image-based religions. And then you have a whole other category of religion that's more philosophical, in nature. Buddhism, you can put it in all kinds of different categories, but do you know there's some Buddhists that are atheist? So, when you think of Buddhism, you don't necessarily think of atheism, but there's a whole segment of Buddhism. There are millions of Buddhists that are atheists altogether. And so, it's very difficult to take the religions of the world and say a Hindu believes, or a Muslim believes, or a Sikh believes, or a Jain believes, because they could believe almost anything and yet have that category tagged to their identity. What's most important is to know what the individual that you care about believes, to sit down and to talk to them. It's interesting that when the Apostle Paul was in one of the most religious places in all the world, he was in Athens, and he was on the top of Mars Hill. It was called the Areopagus. And if you go to Mars Hill even today in Athens, you can see all of the remnants of all of the gods that were there. And when Paul went to Mars Hill, standing on this hill overlooking the ancient city of Athens, talking to all these philosophers, this is what he said. Men of Athens, as I was walking through and considering the objects of your worship, I even found an altar to an unknown God. This God, whom you worship without knowing, I proclaim to you. He's the God who made heaven and earth, and He's the God who does not dwell in temples made with hands as though He needs anything. He gives to all men life, breath, and all things. And what's interesting about the way Paul dealt with that hyper-religious place where on every corner there was a statue to another god, and every god had a story, and every god was prayed to for a particular reason. It was a hyper-religious environment. What's interesting is Paul understood their religions. He understood their stories. And he took a bridge between his own faith and their own faith upon which the gospel could easily roll. So read further down in the passage. He starts quoting their prophets. See, Paul wasn't the type of Christian that steps in and judges other faiths on the surface. Paul is the type of Christian that walks in and listens before he speaks and is prepared before he shares the gospel. And when he shares the gospel, the people that are standing around are saying, wow, he really does understand us. And when people feel like you understand them, then they're far more open to you telling them what you think they should understand.